You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
Welcome back, everyone, to episode 27 of Arsenal Pass. I'm Brendan Patrick, joined always by calling champion Hayden Dale. Hayden, how are you doing?
Good, Brendan. How are you?
Pretty good. So today we'll be talking about sideboarding in Classic Constructed. Sideboarding, or pre-boarding, as it is more appropriately called, is the act of putting cards in or taking cards out of your deck before the match is played. These can be tech cards specifically meant for the matchup, such as six attacks against Prism, or even swapping enough cards in and out of your deck to change your core archetypes, such as mid-range to control. Sideboarding is key to Classic Constructed, and the feature that sets it apart most from other formats like Blitz. Anyway, Hayden, let's talk about your week in Flesh and Blood.
Yeah. I had a really good week. I got to play my first in-person event in about almost 4 months now, actually. So it was awesome. Went down, played a local armory last night. We're recording on, Thursday morning my time. So yeah, Wednesday night, which was, was great. It's like the first time I've played in-person play for so long. So it was good to see some people I hadn't seen in a while, some friends, and jam some games. So yeah,
what did you play?
I played some Brute. Did some Brute action. Chose
Classic Constructed, huh?
I did, yeah, Classic Constructed with a Rhinar flavor. Just had the deck in the bag, and thought we'll play some Brute tonight. So no, it was good. And then other than that, yeah, just more Classic Constructed testing. We did another online draft on the weekend. People have asked how we've done in the past. We've used TTS, so it's not like the perfect way to do it, but it's a good way to get some drafts in. And it's pretty easy to do, which is awesome. And you can do it across time zones and continents.
Pretty easy to do is a bit of an overstatement, I think. It is easy to do if you have a disciplined set of adults. If you have anybody who's slightly gonna be funky in there, it's a nightmare because stuff snaps together. Oh god. Drafting in TTS is legitimately terrible.
It's not ideal, but it's better than nothing. But no, hoping to get a real life draft in either this weekend or early next week. So yeah, no, it's been a good week. How about yours? I mean, you've had a much more exciting week. As much as I've been excited to get out of the house and play some Flesh and Blood, you've actually been traveling and playing an event over the weekend.
Yeah, so I traveled up to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to play in the Team Covenant Sealed event. I think there was around 50 people on the day, and we did Tales of Aria Sealed top 8 draft. So I went undefeated in the Swiss on Briar. Then I'm drafting Briar as well. Not that don't take a hit from this. Like, I think Briar's really good. That's not the case. My draft deck was a pile of garbanzo beans, so it was looking pretty rough. And there was another guy who had made top 8, a guy named Zach Bunn. Some of you guys may know him. He was on the our time in the round recently, and the CEO of Team Covenant over there. So I actually ended up meeting him in the finals, and I drafted some kind of Briar pingers and just all around garbage as well. And he had Heart of Ice, so I definitely was working. It was a little, I had an uphill battle to go, but he ended up beating me in the end. It was just like. Yeah, it was a tough match with the Heart of Ice, and then he kind of hit me for a lot on the first few turns. I wasn't able to pitch my deck to set up an effective end game because if I ever took my my foot off the pedal, as they say, he would have just cracked me back probably for lethal. So it was brutal. It was kind of a grindy one, but congratulations to Zach, champion. Hopefully he can replicate it again at the calling, as well as myself and Dante. We're all hoping to do well, but. Yeah, other than that, regular testing schedule, cool event, really enjoyed it. Team Covenant, awesome people. If you don't know who they are, check them out. Just a great content creator out there, and they have a great service as well for getting product.
Yeah, an awesome service for smaller games, which is fantastic. And Zach's got you back to back now at events. So
Zach has beat me in XP events. I think that Zach has beat me more than anybody in North America, in actual XP events. I'd have to think there might be a local that's beat me twice, but it's hard to say.
I'm looking
Zach is steamrolling me. He's my freaking kryptonite right now. But it's okay. I'll meet him in the calling, and I'm just gonna show him who show him his boss.
I'm looking out for Zach this weekend. The calling. Zach is Zach's a good player. Looking to see what he does this weekend at the calling.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's talk about the news.
Let's talk about it.
Oh yeah, let's talk about it. I'm not used to having the first bullet point on the news, but do you want to shout out? We did have a Levia deck tech go up on YouTube. So yeah, obviously we've been talking about Levia a lot. Was kind of not one of our main decks, but it was definitely a pivotal deck in our testing group for Monarch, and obviously it's just kind of gotten better since then, since Chain has taken the hit that he did. So a really exciting deck moving into Tales of Aria, especially in lieu of this Prism epidemic that we've entered. Levia is a great choice. So yeah, we do have the deck tech up. If you are interested in more information past the deck tech, such as the sideboard guide, deck theory, ratios, math, Excel sheets, all that fun stuff, we got that hosted on the Arsenal Pass Patreon, so check it out. And yeah, like I said earlier, this weekend is the Calling Dallas, so it is a limited Tales of Aria Calling, and it's going to be exciting. I mean, we did excuse me, we did come off the Las Vegas Calling, which was classic constructed, and now we have our first limited event. I would say first limited event in North America, but obviously we had the early ones in 2019, so kind of I don't know. Even though I was a finalist at one of them and I got my PT off it, I will say the first real limited calling in North America. So going to be really exciting. Tales of Aria is also an awesome set. I hope I do get to draft it on day 2. But yeah, Channel Fireball is doing production, coverage, all that good stuff. So check it out if you're interested in it. And if you are at the event and you do see me, I have recently re-dyed my hair, actually about 10 minutes ago, and it did come out quite purple. So if you see me, say hi. I've got this ridiculous colored hair.
Yeah, and I will be watching along, looking out for Brendan's hair actually on the coverage. So if anyone's going to be following along on Twitch, I believe Channel 5 will, of course, again streaming it. So come join me in the the chat, and we'll watch. We'll see what happens. I'm excited to see some limited play. Actually, I think that the set is pretty interesting with how people build their sealed pools. I think the draft on day 2 will be super interesting as well.
For sure. Cool.
Other news items. So I guess a pretty big one this week with the announcement of the out of print of Crucible. So LSS have announced that Crucible of War as a set, as of now, the final runs are headed to distributors. This is on Unlimited as well. Is on the way to distributors or with distributors. Pretty short statement from LSS just saying that they won't be reprinting Crucible of War again, which I think when they released their statement for Unlimited originally it was across 3 waves. I don't know if people, if it was clear or what would happen in the future around the printings or whether Unlimited would stop after those waves. But as we now know, with the statement that they will not be reprinting Crucible of War Unlimited. So yeah, a bit of an interesting one there. And there's a lot of discussion in the community, more so than I guess I probably haven't really had time to digest it, so I don't really have too much to say on it right now.
Yep, I have absolutely nothing to say on it, so on to the next one.
Yeah, I think one thing I will say is that they have said that cards printed in Crucible of War could very well be printed in the future. There's not saying these cards won't be reprinted again, so it would be, I guess, a case-by-case basis. Obviously, we saw Tunic printed in Crucible after being printed in Weapons Wraith, so we have seen cards reprinted. It's not out of the question.
I'm just really looking forward to, a reserve list or something like that. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm never going to get one of those.
Disgusting. All right. Anyway, let's move on. I wanted to call out, there's some really great articles on the Fab TCG website right now. There's a new rules article put up by Josh Scott, who's I believe his title is like the rules manager, rules advisor. I'm actually not sure. Sorry, Josh. But he does a series of these like reprise articles, which just kind of talk about some of the hot topics in rulings, or a lot of rulings that are being asked about commonly. There's one on the ball lightning interaction that went up last week. So these are really good to check out if you're heading to events, and some of these cards that are sort of hot on everyone's lips, cards that people are playing, interactions that people are sort of talking about. You can go and see these in a really digestible way. You don't have to go and read the comprehensive rules to or the release notes to find out some of these things. They're just kind of nice hot button topics on the website. Mm-hmm. Also on the Fab TCG website, we talked about this a little bit last week while we did our draft pod, but there's also these really great drafting 101 articles from the developers up on there for Tales of Aria. So, if you are heading to the calling this weekend, or you're maybe heading to a draft, or, whatever it might be, just playing some limited, these are great things to check out there. Really talk about some of the archetypes in the 3 heroes. They're very very bite-sized, very easy to sort of take some really sort of core and key takeaways from them, which is nice. So yeah, there's a new one up there. I think the latest one is on Old Time, but I think every hero has one now as well, which is good.
And on that note, this week's Time in the Round features Flesh and Blood developer Carol. So be sure to check out for that. Watch out for that episode. Sorry, when it does drop. I think it's on Saturday, right? It definitely is.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I'm gonna announce this now so that Hayden has to do it no matter how busy he is. He may cut me out. He may edit this, but we are going to move Time in the Round to all podcast platforms. The way it's going to work is that Time in the Round will be released on YouTube first. Then there will be a delay period before it gets onto all the podcast platforms. I know a lot of people like listening to this podcast on Spotify, Apple, whatever it is, and they want to do the same with Time in the Round for obvious reasons. Our kind of ethos behind not doing that was to funnel the audience to YouTube and kind of get everyone together in one place. But in lieu of convenience, and because we're now moved to the structure where you do have a guest on every time, and I think that it is kind of adding something unique to the space right now, we are going to move it onto the platforms, which is going to be a bit later. So I know that's going to be some pretty good news for some people that have been asking me.
No, I will definitely not be editing that out. That's something that we've talked about for a couple of weeks now. Just tried to get it I guess across the line and trying to get it done, but it will be happening this weekend. So a couple of days after this comes out, the backlog will be uploaded onto podcast services, and then each week, I think 3 days after the YouTube episode of Time in the Round drops, there will be the podcast or the audio only version uploaded. So you have two options to go and listen to it. You can listen to it twice if you want to. There's some good interviews that we've had. We had Brian last week, Carol this week. So yeah, some great stuff.
Yeah, and also finally, just want to shout out the Patreon. We are over 200 patrons, so it's absolutely incredible. It's just been blowing up, which is awesome for us. So that's the Arsenal Pass Patreon. We do offer exclusive content there. I mentioned that with the Levia deck tech. We do that for every deck tech, as well as exclusive pods, live sessions, and obviously that personal Midas touch, with communicating with us on the actual Patreon. So check it out if it's something you're interested in. It is very much an extension of our podcast or of our YouTube, and just a great way to interact more with the community. I do want to mention, as we close out the news here, is that next week is going to be a double gameplay because we had some issues in production this past week. We weren't able to upload the gameplay. Luckily, we had the deck tech, so we were able to get content out. But next week, we're going to have to do, we will make it up. We got double gameplay. And as always, if you're listening to this on YouTube, go ahead and shoot us a comment of what heroes you want to see us play, because we haven't picked them yet. Yeah. Anyway, Hayden.
I think Brendan ended up sitting on the hard drive is what happened. So unfortunately, we did lose the gameplay.
And for a 5/3 man at 75 pounds, I'm surprised it broke. But anyway, Hayden, let's talk about the Command and Cookout.
Yeah, let's get into the Command and Cookout. I feel like I had something to mention before we left off, but you know what? It's slipped my mind, so we'll just move on. Command and Cookout this week. So as always, if you do want to get you promised, Brendan, you promised all of our listeners a spicy intro, and we didn't get one, but that's okay. I'll let you defer it to next week. If you want to get your questions in for the Command and Cookout, please send those through to arsenalpassfab@gmail.com. And if there's a question that's really in depth that you want to drop in the comments as well, then please do, and we'll try and get to those, or we might pick it up on the pod next week. I am commandeering the Command and Cookout section this week for myself, Brendan, to pose a couple of questions to you. So selfish, but I have a couple of things I want to ask. So Calling Dallas is this weekend, so I wanted to get a few sort of insights, into what we might expect for the Calling Dallas. You just, this past weekend played in Tulsa in the Team Covenant sealed event. So, you played a big sealed event, you played a top 8 draft. Very, very obviously smaller scale of what we're going to see this weekend in Dallas, but, an emulation of some ways of the format we're going to see. So, a few questions for you. First of all, what do you think of the sealed format going in? Do you think that we're going to see players try and, I guess, play a hero that they want to, force a hero almost, or players are going to actually look to sealed? In the last sealed format, we saw a lot of Prism being played, right?
Yep. We definitely did see a lot of Prism, but in this format, we're going to see probably a bigger disparity. I think that Briar is more popular than Prism was. Prism was like overrated, right? Like it was legitimately overrated, and there was a lot of available strategies to beat that deck in sealed. For my opinion, and I'm sorry that I haven't been able to have something more spicy or hard take. I do think that Briar is actually like on average quite decent in sealed. So it's one of the easier picks. And you can have a Briar pool that's pretty average that does quite well, especially if you draw the cards in the correct order. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's going to be a ton of Briar in sealed, a ton, like actually so much. And then obviously followed up by Oldhim, and I think finally Lexi. Like Lexi, a lot of people are scared of. A lot of people are scared of getting fatigued. What's funny is that over the past month, almost all of my sealed games have not been against Pile or whatever you want to call it. So they have been like 30 deck v 30 deck or 32 or something like that. And, of course, it's much worse for me because my opponents started thinking a little bit more rather than playing 40 card decks. When we get to the calling, there's going to be a lot of people playing 40 card decks. That is more concerning to me, like, in terms of like the threat of that strategy, is if I'm playing Lexi. If I'm playing anything else, it's a total joke. So, yeah, I think that all of those factors lead to Lexi being probably pretty unpopular in the sealed portion. And yeah, I don't know. Hey, let's get your thoughts on the sealed portion before I delve into old draft here.
Well, I have, I'd say I have more questions, but my view on sealed, I think I've played a lot less than yourself. Obviously, it's not a format that is really that relevant for myself. No sealed events coming up. Nationals on the horizon at some point, but that's draft. So I've kind of left sealed to yourself and Dante and been moving on with classic constructed. But I think from the games we did play, obviously the first couple of weeks played a lot of sealed. I do think that there's certain cards you're looking for to make your sealed pools viable in different heroes. Briar does feel to me like it is the one that you can kind of cobble together, and if your sealed pool's kind of weak, you can still have a pretty coherent game plan, especially if you just have a couple of cards that can really push through like late game damage. But I do think as well that the Lexi is probably being underbuilt. I've seen a lot of pools where I feel like there's pretty reasonable Lexi decks in there, and some really good ways to close out games with like a couple of pumps, a couple of really strong arrows that can confuse reasonably well into the late game. One of the cool things, I actually think Lexi is the deck that is one of the easiest to, I guess, pitch for an in-game with, because your fuses have a lot more impact in the late game to like stop pivot turns, help with dominate. You've dominated on a stick, so you can always push dominate in the late game. So yeah, that's probably my kind of take on sealed. But I want to ask you, Brendan, before you get into draft, you sit down on Saturday, you open your sealed pool. What's like the one card that you're hoping to open? If you could pick, one card first pack, what's
Deep
the
blue.
card?
Yeah, it's deep blue.
Deep blue.
It's like it's literally not even close. Like there's broken cards like Oakenold. Like Oakenold is freaking broken in sealed. It's the dumbest card. It's obviously it's not induction chamber level dumb, but it's still dumb. Because if you play that, you double fuse it. It is really game losing. But I have to be somewhat reasonable. So I think I have to pick something between the common and rare slot. And it's deep blue. It's all day long. Like that's what you want in your sealed pools, is you want that deep blue. The effect of that card on the format and what you can do with your deck if you have that in there, and how differently you can build it, I think is massive. And I love deep blue so much. It's just the greatest card.
How many times can Brendan say deep blue and
It's the alliteration of love.
Okay, so deep blue is the card you want to see when you open your packs on Saturday. Let's talk about draft then. So let's say you make it to day 2, and hopefully all things are going well and you've tested and you make it to day 2. Sit down at your table. Do you have any we don't need to dive too deep into this, but do you have any preconceived ideas heading into that draft, or are you pretty open to what the table feeds you?
Oh, my preconceived idea is that a lot of potatoes are going to try to force Briar, which is like not fantastic in draft. And that's not because Briar is way worse in draft. It's just like this format, you don't force. You definitely do not force in this format. You're going to end up with a terrible deck most of the time. But if I want to give you a positive thing to go in with, it's just that I'm going to play a safe draft. I'm going to play a smart draft. And after the testing we've done, I don't want to go into too deep. I know that's really ambiguous, but trust me, I'd be giving away way too many sprinkles if I said anything more. Yeah, you play conservative to an extent. And I think that's really important in Tales of Aria, because you can get absolutely, shafted by doing,
Yeah.
doing the wrong thing.
And we, if you do want to hear a bit more about draft, we did talk about draft on the pod last week and did dive in with some things about Tales of Aria that I think are important sort of takeaways for this early format, things that you can sort of come into draft with. So yeah, I mean, I don't know why you're sitting at a table of potatoes. I don't know how potatoes can draft, but I'm not sure what that means. But anyway, Brendan.
I will explain. People aren't potatoes, but people who try to force Briar in draft because they think that it's overpowered, that's a potato right there.
Well, sounds like you're trying to get everyone to not draft Briar so you can pick up the cards. That's what I'm hearing.
Okay, I mean, all right, Hayden, we talked about this. You're not supposed to say it on the pod.
No, not at all. Not at all. I will say one thing on draft. I think if you can find the seat where you're one of the two drafters on a hero, so presumably you can have 3 on one hero, 3 on another hero, and then 2 on a third hero. If you can find yourself in the seat where you're in one of the 2 drafters, or maybe maybe there's 4 of one hero and you get to find yourself in a solo seat, which is pretty tough to do. But if you're in the one of the 2, the duo seat, you're going to put yourself in a really good position to have a really strong draft. Find your class cards coming back around the table because there's only one other person taking them. So that is kind of one of my goals when I sit down at a Tales of Aria draft, is try and find that, try and be one of those two hero drafters. And that's not always going to happen. So sometimes you're going to have to commit before that can happen, but it's definitely something that that's my only goal, I think, is if I can find myself in that seat, I'm probably going to be in a good position.
That's the ideal state of most good players, There are probably some people out there that actively don't want to play a certain class, and maybe we will get to a format where one class is significantly less powerful than the other. This is not that class. Yeah, I mean, this is not that format.
No,
so yeah, that situation you described, I think, is the ideal state of any competent player.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll take that as a compliment, and I'll put it back in the repertoire. Let's move on. Let's head into the main topic of the pod, Brendan.
Awesome. So we talked a little bit about it in the introduction, but Hayden, why don't you expand on what we mean when we say sideboarding?
Yeah, sideboarding. You talked about it at the top of the show, right, Brendan? It is, sideboarding, pre-boarding. It's the pre-game procedure, right? Which is where all this is happening, where you're setting your deck up for the match that you're about to play. So it really is all about, first of all, coming in with the right setup. So having the matchups in mind that you're going to play against and what you're actually going to do to your 80 cards to make sure that you're set up for those. You're probably going to have a core, whether your core is between 40, 50 cards, and we've talked about deck building and cores before on the pod. You can go back and check out that episode if you want from probably a couple months ago now. But you're going to have that, and then you're going to have these 20, 30 extra cards. And those cards are going to come in and be your pre-board, sideboard that are going to allow you to set the deck up in the way to play the matchup, the way that you want to play it. Whether it's, you might be pre-boarding just to, add a few defensive pieces in. You might be pre-boarding to slow the game down a little bit, or to, augment your current plan. Or you might be trying to change your game plan entirely, right? You might be moving from this more mid-range deck, you're taking out some of your aggressive red cards, and you're putting in, some more defense reactions, some more late-game cards that allow you to pitch deck and set up for an end game. So that's really what you're doing in a pre-boarding, sideboarding, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about how to design a sideboard. And you can't do that without talking about why you would choose certain cards to enter your sideboard cards. So the lowest hanging fruit here is cards that are, in there to counter certain matchups or make weaker matchups better. This is easily, the most easy way to represent this is through Prism with the 6 attacks. You just pump in your 6 attacks, and you're going to be doing a lot better versus Heralds if you didn't have them most of the time. Then you've got cards that are going to enhance your game plan, right? Like I've got a shell of an aggressive Katsu shell. It's around 47 cards. I sit down across the table from another aggro matchup. Maybe I'm just pumping in 13 more cards that are just going to speed me up. I had the Razor Reflexes. I add, maybe another combo line, all that good stuff, just to make sure I can go as fast as possible. I'm not going to need that other part of my sideboard that might be defense reactions to help me deal with something like Bravo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's actually because you just talked about, like cards like Silver Bullets or cards that are specifically coming to help counter a matchup. And I actually think in Flesh and Blood, that's a lot more difficult than in other games. So in other games, you might have cards that have they have these single-dimensional aspects to them, right? So, they come in and they say destroy something, or they say counter something, or they say X can't be played. And we have a little bit of that, right? We've got cards like Chains of Eminence, we saw like the prevalence of snag as like a specific targeted counter card in the last format, right? But primarily what you're going to find is that your cards that you bring in, if we're talking about specific cards, they're going to help fill a role rather than be specifically for one turn or for one scenario. They're more so like if you use a defense reaction for an example, right? The situation of those cards is that they come into your deck and they help you to be able to stop on hit effects that your opponent's going to attack you with. But you've also got to like consider the negative impact of these as well, right? Which is something that we're going to, I think, talk about later.
For sure. I think it's important to note, like with sideboards, you can change your deck to adapt to your opponent's expected strategy. So, sometimes it looks like changing your game plan entirely. So for instance, Rhinar mid-range switching to control, or Dash switching from control to mid-range. So we do have, there are a lot of silver bullet cards like you talked about, but sometimes it's a complete archetype shift on the entire game plan, right?
Yeah, it is. And if we're talking about, we're saying about how do you design a sideboard, you really have to start with the core of the deck. So whenever you've got to have first of all, you need like a single game plan. You need to have an idea of how you're going to play your game. So let's just assume we've got that already. We've got an idea of how we're going to play our game plan. Let's use, why not? Let's use Rhinar as an example, right? I'm going to play a game plan where I'm going to be pretty aggressive. I'm going to look to trigger lots of intimidates to, deny my opponent the ability to defend well. That's my core game plan. Now, if I'm looking at how to design a sideboard, well, I'm thinking like, first of all, there's a few different aspects that I need to consider. Right? It's like, what are my weaknesses? What am I weak to? That's how I'm going to choose how to design a sideboard first and foremost, probably because I want to tackle my sideboard, my pre-board in a way that's going to allow me to fix those matchups, quote unquote. So if I say I think a weak matchup for me is like a super like hyper aggressive decks with on hit effects, so like Katsu aggro is like that's my worst nightmare. So that's where I'm going to start, right? So if I have a core of a deck, then how many cards do I think I need to have in my sideboard that can adapt my game plan to play in that fashion? And then the kind of, I guess, the thought process you can go through is like, okay, is there like silver bullets? Can I just chuck a few defense reactions in? Or do I actually have to change my game plan entirely? So I'm now sat there at the sort of point, right, Brendan, where you're going, well, can I just throw 6 to 9 cards in that fit into my game plan okay? Or actually, if I put in 6 to 9 defense reactions, does that change my game plan so drastically? Like I can't enable these strong 4 and 5 card hands anymore because I've got these defense reactions. Do I now need to change my game plan entirely?
Yeah, for sure. And I think I want to kind of extrapolate a bit when you said that, which you talked about the core. So you can't talk about sideboards or pre-boards without talking about a core. And a core is just the way we like to look at it. Obviously, you can just have a 60-card core, take things in and out. But the way we like to approach it is having 44 to 57 cards. Kind of these 44 cards or whatever it is my deck will execute its game plan every single time with just these cards. This is what it absolutely needs to just get its its core game plan across, and then everything else just comes in accordingly, or helps enhance the game plan, right? Because sometimes it's not going to be a silver bullet scenario where it's like, I just bring in my 6 attacks versus Prism. Sometimes sitting around, it's like kind of, this is what you understand to be a 50-50 matchup. And there are no particular silver bullets to help you against this specific hero. And you're just like, okay, now I bring in my 13 other cards that I need, or 17 other cards that are just going to help me, my game plan, be more effective, right? It might be in the case where you're like, yeah, if I could play these 44 cards, that is my game plan, it would be powerful. But unfortunately, you do have to play 60. So these are going to come in, they're going to enhance and just going to accentuate that core plan.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think if you even take it back a step further, you simplify it even more, right? There's a few different things that you could do. So you could enhance your current game plan. So I'm just going to keep using this Rhinar example because I think it's an easy one and it's probably pretty easy to grab onto. I could enhance my game plan, so I want to be even more aggressive. I want to put even more pressure on and deny even more cards from my opponent's hand. And my pre-board helps me supplement my plan in that way. Maybe my sideboard actually helps me supplement my deck by changing the game plan, like we just talked about. So I can enhance my game plan, I could change my game plan, or I could do something in between where I bring some more, like you say, targeted cards in, which allow me to play basically the same game plan, but on certain turns, maybe I get to play slightly off plan hands. So rather than just being like, Raj and Beat Down, Blood Rush Bellows, or some combination of these cards, Alpha Rampage on most turns. Maybe now every 4th or 5th turn, I have these, reasonable defense reactions in my deck where my plan actually becomes like, block out with 3 cards, use a defense reaction, get a setup card into Arsenal. Like maybe that is now what my plan looks slightly different, but basically the same. So yeah, I can augment, I could change, or I could just supplement slightly with some targeted cards.
Yeah, when talking about sideboards, I think it's really important to be careful, right? You have to pay attention to those ratios as you add in all these new cards. Like those defense reactions may feel real good when a Crippling Crush comes across the table, but they also might be devastating when you draw them on turns where you have to pivot.
Yeah. If you're like thinking about the design of your sideboard, right? It's like there's so many different things to consider. So if you take one of those 3 routes that we talked about, then yeah, what are the cards that I'm actually bringing in do to my core game plan? So if you're changing your core game plan, that's one thing. But if you're actually looking to supplement it a little bit, change it a little bit, those cards are going to have an impact. My favorite example of that, right, is defense reactions in Katsu. I think early days of Flesh and Blood, we saw a lot of Katsus kind of just have their core aggressive deck with Razor Reflexes and combo lines and scars and snatches, and then they might have like unmovables and sink belows and flick flacks in their sideboard. And it's like, yeah, you can bring these cards in, but what does that do to like, can you afford these cards? Can you afford to be playing an unmovable? Now you have a bunch of red cards in your deck that aren't aggressive. Do you have enough damage in your deck now? Like, is your ratio of damage to resources now correct? And then, it's turn 3 of the game. You've just taken the tempo, and you draw up and you've got an unmovable and a sink below in your hand. It'll be very difficult for you to keep the tempo when you've got 2 cards that actively do nothing on the offense in your hand. So whenever you decide, or when you start sit down to design a sideboard, a pre-board plan, one of the things I think is most important is like, how does this impact my core game plan? And if you're purposely trying to change your core game plan, then that's fine. That's one thing. But if you're actually not purposely trying to change it, you're just trying to tweak it, trying to do these little movements, turn the dial here and there. One small turn of the dial can massively impact your overall game plan.
Mm-hmm. And Hayden, so what are some ratios other than pitch and resource, obviously, that we should potentially be paying attention to? When we're adding in these sideboard cards.
You can ping attention to if you want. Yeah, I mean, me, big fan of ratios, but it's not just resource ratios that I'm sort of considering. It's like it's everything else. Everything that when you look at balancing and weighing up your deck could be a ratio. So if we're talking about sideboarding in the new age, maybe we're Briar players, or we're picking up Old Time for the first time, or we're picking up Lexi, and we're thinking about some sideboard plans. So we've got like this really strong core plan. Let's use Briar. We've got this like really explosive Lightning Briar deck that we're happy with maybe, and we're thinking about some sideboard options. And there's some like cards that we really like the look of. Maybe they're from older sets, and they're not element cards, so they're not they're not lightning cards. If I start jamming some of these cards in, maybe it's because I want like more 0 attacks, so I don't have to pay for them as much against ice. And then I start taking out, lightning cards to put, snatches and scar for a scars into my deck. Maybe I'm actively changing the ratios of my elements, right? So I'm taking out these lightning cards that help me fuse, these cards that help me set up my big turns to put in these cards that, in my eyes, in my view, my sideboard plan is to reduce my cost structure against these ice decks. Could be one of the things I'm looking to do, but I'm actually actively changing my ratios. So that's I think a pretty relevant example to the current format of one of the ratios that you have to consider. But it's not like Brendan and I, we've talked about this. It's not just resources. It's not just element cards. It could be the number of attack actions in your deck versus non-attack actions. If you're playing something like some of these Runeblade heroes, it could be the defense value of your deck. So I think about this in Levia quite a lot. If you're playing Levia and you're like I want to bring in these like Deep-Rooted Evils and these, I want to play like Shadow Blasphemer and Pulpings and all these cards. It's like, well, if I'm bringing some of these in from my sideboard for a certain matchup, like maybe I'm bringing Pulping in to be more aggressive. I'm putting in more cards into my deck that don't defend. Like, how does that hurt my game plan? So, yeah, there's more when it comes to sideboarding and deck building, but especially in sideboarding because you've probably already got your core set. There's so many things to consider with your ratios and what you're changing, and not just your resources, not just, well, I bring in 4 red cards and I take out 2 blue cards. I throw my ratio of resources off. I'm like, there's a lot of things you're changing when it comes to ratios. I'm sure I've probably missed some examples right there, Brendan.
Well, on that note, I just want to hit some quick do's and don'ts of sideboard cards. So, do have cards that help you in weaker matchups. Don't overboard to where your core game plan no longer functions. Big trap. Do consider your ratios after boarding in each matchup. And don't cut resource cards to fit extra sideboard cards. There are some offenders in our testing group. I won't name them, but they are incredible players. But yeah, if you cut cutting the resource cards to try to get in some more gas cards, I'll be into some matchups. That's definitely a trap. So make sure you're kind of hitting that resource curve you need, staying consistent. In Flesh and Blood, often the most consistent plan is going to be the best, especially if you're looking at some of these big tournaments. You got to go through these large rounds of Swiss and then come in the top 8. Consistency is the key. Anyway, let's talk about how to. What did you say, Mr. Dale? What was that?
I want to talk about consistency. Actually, why you just like throwing it out there? Yeah, before we jump to the, I'm just regathering myself, Brendan. Before we jump to the next point about sideboarding, you talked about consistency, and I wanna harp back on that for a second. But first of all, I did want to say, Brendan has come to the realization, that cutting resources for power cards is a bit of a trap, and I'm glad to hear that he's finally admitting it.
Sometimes I get a little frisky, and I still kind of do it,
Yeah. How many blues are you playing in this matchup? Just 10. 10. No, I don't think not that bad. But I want to talk about consistency because that is one of the, if you are playing a game where you get to actively set up the second half of the game with the cards that you want to see, the cards that you want to draw, and that's what we're doing with Flesh and Blood, right? If you get back to your second cycle, you get to set that up. You get to set up the cards that you're going to be playing into. Consistency is really important because it comes from that, right? But you actually want consistency in like the first cycle of your deck as well, because you won't get to the second cycle if your first cycle doesn't have consistency, or you'll be in matchups where the second cycle of your deck, it won't matter, or even you might be playing a deck where it doesn't matter. So consistency in those situations is really key. And one of the ways that, when you look at sideboarding and pre-boarding, whatever you want to call it, when you're looking at setting your deck up in the pre-game procedure, there's certain plans where I think you want to trade consistency for power, and vice versa. So, I think I'm just going to continue to run with this Reiner, I guess, example, because I've started with it. But let's just say I'm playing into this ninja deck, this aggressive ninja deck. It's a real concern for me. Consistency is going to be less important to me in that matchup, where I feel like I'm already a bit of a dog in that matchup. I feel like I'm on the bad side of that matchup. I would rather trade some power into my deck for an opportunity to probably be able to set up turns to win the game. So I feel like if I can consistently do something that's not good into a matchup, that's not good, right? That's still not going to be good for me, unless they stumble or they have bad hands or get some bad variants, whatever it might be, or play a bit badly. Whereas, if I can trade a bit of that consistency for a bit of potential power spikes that could allow me to get hands that win the game, well, I have, a little bit of chance to actually to get something out of that match. So there are situations where, as much as I want consistency, I will generally keep the core of my deck very consistent as possible. But there are times where I'm willing to trade some of that consistency for power, especially in the sideboard of my decks, and that's where that sort of comes in with pre-board and sideboard. So, against aggressive decks, that might be an opportunity if I use my Rhino example. On the flip side of that, maybe I'm playing into another mid-range deck. I'm going to value consistency really highly. If I'm able to grind out that game, just get small advantages over the game against another mid-range deck, that's probably going to be all I need. So I will go back for the consistency play.
Yeah, consistency is the word of the day for Mr. Hayden.
Consistency versus power.
I want to talk about how to set up a sideboard plan. And my favorite and first point here is don't have any dead cards in your sideboard. And you're like, what? No, you would be surprised. You set up a sideboard, you write it out, and it's a key word there, right? Or key set of words, write it out. Because I've set up a sideboard, had cards on my sideboard, written out every single matchup. Then I realized that there was, maybe one or two cards on my board that literally never came in. Maybe I'm just not very intelligent, which is, I've been accused of that before. But sure, no. Definitely write it out and make sure that you're actually utilizing the sideboard that you've allotted slots for.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. First of all, that's not what I thought you were going to say when you went for point one. I don't know why. I just had other stuff in my head. But the idea of this, of writing this out, there's a kind of I think it's like a process. So when you have the core of your deck and you're trying to design a sideboard, you're going to start to target matchups like we talked about, right? So it could be matchups that you're weaker into. It could be matchups where, you want to completely change your game plan. Like whatever your sideboard strategy is, however you've designed your sideboard, let's just say that you have a 50 card core, right? That's going to leave you with, say you play 6 equipment because you have a null rune equipment. That's going to leave you with 24 cards sitting off to the side that you can feasibly put into your deck, right? So I'm going to need to play 10 of those in the matchup. And if that's 10 cards that just completely change my deck, okay, that's what those 10 cards are dedicated to. And then maybe I have a few other cards that are dedicated to, in a couple other matchups, just like tweaking my core game plan slightly. And in the end, we end up with like 20 cards that are accounted for, plus the 50 main deck. And then you're set with these other 4 cards. And often the temptation is just to be like, well, I would just like play 4 really good cards. I'll just put in like 4 more defense reactions, or, I'll put in 4 of, this like really good attack action, whatever it might be. And what you might find is actually you never end up bringing those cards in, or you do bring them in and they don't actually help your deck. They're good cards, but your game plan is so cohesive that these now 4 cards just make your game plan worse. They don't work with that transformational sort of sideboard plan that you're working with. They're just kind of dead, right? So
yep.
You go through.
Like, sorry, I just don't want to. It's like a perfect example is you can't just shove CNC into every deck. Just kidding.
See, I actively avoided that one.
You absolutely can. It's flesh and blood. Shove it in that deck.
Well, I mean, CNC is a very easy card to put in almost any deck, right? Like I probably am not jamming into my Akano deck, for instance, right? But it's like it's a card that's easy to put in. E-Strike's another one that's pretty easy to put into decks. So people do this, and do you know what? It's fine. Like there's times where it's not going to make sense. It's like, well, it's not an Earth card to help me with my Earth fuses. It's not a an ice card that helps with my ice fuse, or it's not, a payoff card, whatever it might be. There's times where it's like, well, there's just no room for this really strong card. And that's perfectly fine, right? Because you're focused on synergies. But, anyway, I digress. Going back to the sideboard piece is like these 4 cards, rather than just like shoehorn and jam some stuff in there, what I would suggest and say is one of the best processes to take when it comes to designing and sort of coming up with your sideboard plan is to go away, like write it out, as Brendan said. So what cards are coming in for what matchup, because I'm either changing my game plan in one matchup, or I'm supplementing my game plan in one matchup, or whatever it is. You come to the end and go, okay, like what are the cards that maybe feel like dead weight? Either they don't come in any matchups, they come in one matchup. Then you revise, right? You reset and you go, okay, now I have this plan. Like these 4 cards that I've chosen, maybe they're coming in one matchup, and maybe that's fine, right? Because maybe it's a matchup that's like probably going to be 5 to 10% of your expected meta, and that's like okay to commit those cards to because they're not really doing anything else. But if they don't come in at all, then probably go back and just start to think, what could these be? Could these be something that supplement my game plan? Could it be for like an obscure matchup because I just have the slots available for it? A bad matchup that maybe people won't play, but I have the slots. Maybe it's 3 null rune equipment because like I'm not very good against Wizard, and someone might play Wizard. And then just go and test. Like go and test your sideboard plans. Play a couple of games into each of those matchups you've come up with that sideboard plan. Your transformational, maybe your supplemental, those 2 sort of like key game plans that you've come up with, your pre-game plans, and see how they go. And then you've got 4 slots to play with. It might turn out that actually you want those 4 slots to be, for that. We talked about that transformational plan. Maybe I'm using my Rhinar example again. I'm playing a Rhinar deck. I've got a 50 card core. I want to bring in 10 cards that are going to help me move into like a more of a controlling sort of style deck. Maybe actually I need more cards than that. There's like 4 cards in that plan of my core that just don't feel right. They don't block properly, or they don't help me do anything. And I decide that actually the last 4 slots that I've got available on my sideboard, they're going to be 4 more cards for this specific plan. So now I'm going to bring in 14 cards in, and I'm going to be cutting 4 cards, whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. And I, like you said, this is something that I preach. I think maybe to a fault, but definitely write down the sideboard for many different reasons. We can avoid, the problems of having cards on a board that we don't play. But also, I think it's always important to do as much work as you can before you sit down in front of your opponent, right? And this includes practice, things like that. But this should by writing down the sideboard should heavily mitigate common sideboarding mistakes that we've all made at some point, right? Where it's like, you were supposed to have in the null rune. Like that one's obviously the most egregious that like a lot of us will forget. Or it's like, oh, I'm actually not supposed to be playing 3 CNC in this matchup. All these kind of things that can creep up when you're just kind of going off memory or something like that. I think it'll also force you to focus on the only thing that matters, which is how you're going to actually win the game. So you don't have to sit down in front of your opponent and be like, okay, let me just kind of reevaluate and reconstruct my entire game plan in my deck. So instead, you have it written out, stay true to the plan. Sometimes you can make some last minute changes. I know that one time at a Road to Nationals, I lost in the final round of Swiss to a chain player who was playing like a very aggressive low blood that list that utilized Flock of the Featherwalkers. I was not playing CNC in the matchup initially. When I met him in the finals, I threw in CNC because Flock of the Featherwalkers is like CNC's, I don't know. It's his best day, right? So, of course, it's going to be a card. And I also threw him in, absolutely won me the game.
Yeah, I really like what you said about, being able to, I guess, be prepared, do as much work before you get to the table. The other thing that I think it really helps with is just like mental fatigue. Like you just don't have to, if you sit down at the table, you already know your game plan. You already know the way that you're going to sideboard, what cards come in, what cards come out, etc., etc. You just don't have to, you can start the game like just thinking about the match. You don't have to be thinking about, oh, did I put that card in? Should I have maybe tweaked this? What might they be playing? What equipment? Rah, rah, rah. You can just be like, yep, I have the list here. Because also, I'm sure people know this, but if you don't, you can have sideboard notes. You can have notes that you can refer to before the game starts. So during the pre-game procedure, that's when you first of all you flip up your hero, and then you have time to decide what equipment you want to play and what deck you're going to present in terms of like cards and your sideboard pre-board plan. So during that time, before you present your deck to your opponent to cut, you can look at and refer to notes, outside notes. So you can come with your full sideboard plan written out, what comes in, what comes out. You can even write yourself a few notes like the most important cards in this matchup are X, Y, Z. So that before you start the game, that's like imprinted in your mind. Those are the things you're thinking about, and I would recommend this actually. So you can do that.
Excuse me, sorry for interrupting you.
No, you're nuts, man.
But I do want to talk about a concept that creeped up in Monarch that is even more relevant as we head into Tales of Aria, and that is, yes, absolutely, hedgeboarding. Hedgeboarding is way more relevant as we head into Tales of Aria. So Flesh and Blood used to be a little bit more clear cut. You would sit down in front of your opponent, you pretty much know what they were playing based off the hero. That is getting close to being much less reliable, right? Especially if you look at the Tales of Aria heroes. Are they lightning? Are they earth? Are they both? Who knows what they're doing, right? This was kind of the example of this in Monarch, was you would sit in front of Katsu. Is it Katsu control? Is it Katsu aggro? Your board plan changes drastically most of the time when you're looking at that. Is it Prism Herald or is it Prism aggro? So I think it's important to develop what we call hedge boards. Sideboard plans that are good into both. They're not great into either, but they're good into both. And this is how you mostly use hedge boards to get through Swiss. And when you're in top 8, then you can commit to your full boards to kind of attack that certain archetype.
So when you say, you talk about a hedge board, what's can you give us an example? Like, what does it mean to hedge board? Like, what am I hedging against? What am I hedging for? What does that kind of mean?
So I'm gonna take you back in time. We're playing Chain. We're playing Monarch. We're at the calling. We sit down in front of a Katsu player. Is it Katsu aggro? Is it Katsu control? Well, if it's Katsu aggro, some of the like all the cards that help me in my end game, I probably don't want them. Especially things like Eclipse. Like I don't want this block 0. All this other crap that would come in. And I'm also playing 60 cards for sure. It's Katsu control. I might play it quite a bit more, but I don't know what it is. So I got to hedge. So what we end up doing is we play the 60 cards, but then we keep in as the minimal amount of tools possible to where if it does turn out to be control, we still can win. Maybe we're the ultra favored to win because we don't have a 67 card deck that's very tuned to beat this. But instead we have a 60 card deck. And, we actually do have Eclipse. So if we do have to run to the end game, I can create my Ursar, I can craft an end game state with my Rift Binds and my Unhallowed Rites and all this good stuff. And I can reliably beat both strategies. But if I had played something like my control build into a Katsu aggro, where I need to be, getting the tempo and applying as much pressure as possible, it'd be a nightmare. And same thing if I, was planning to play, I was sided for aggro against control. So we kind of meet this middle ground where we kind of try to hedge the risk. And that's where the word hedge board comes from.
It's a risk versus reward thing, and I think actually people will realize that they've probably done this for a reasonable amount of time. If you've been playing Flesh and Blood for the past 2 sets, you would probably have actually done this at some point. You could use other examples of sitting down against a Viscerai player. Are they OTK? Are they 1-2 kill orientated, or are they like a mid-range version? You sit down against, even to the extent of like a Prism in the last format, like are they an Aura-based deck or are they a Herald-based deck? And a good example, you're playing into an Aura, a Prism deck, and say you have some 6 attacks in your sideboard. you're going to bring those in, right? Because if they're there for that matchup, and if they're the hero version, you need those, probably because they're in your sideboard. And if they're the aura version, well, now you've got to weigh up the risk. So if they are an aura version, these 6 attacks that are in your sideboard that you're bringing in for this game plan, how much do they hurt your game plan? And that's actually, it's all about the preparation. It's not about the time, what's happening right in the match or before you start the match. It's actually all the preparation you put in ahead of time. Because you should sort of be thinking about, well, is Prism now, as we move through a season, is the aura version of the deck, say, for example, becoming more and more popular? Is it now incorrect for me to actually even have these 6 attacks in my sideboard because going into an unknown Prism player, which is going to be, unless you're in top 8, that's what it's going to be. You're not going to know what they're on. Am I actually going to be bringing these cards in? Or are they so bad into auras that I actually just can't afford to play them? So you're doing this like risk versus reward thing, but you're not actually doing it when you're when you're sat down 2 minutes before the game starts. You're actually doing it all in your planning. Well, at least you should be doing in your planning, in your sideboard planning. That's when you can come up with those hedge boards, as Brendan talks about, and do your bit of your risk versus reward sort of trade-offs and weigh up those options.
Awesome. So let's talk about adapting your plan and implementing, learnings and being willing to change your sideboard plan. So you're going to work up these plans, you're going to write them all out, and sometimes they're just going to fall on their face. So it's really important to reflect on your sideboard plan, get those reps in, revisit it, retune it. It sounds obvious, but nothing is perfect the first time. And it really is, your sideboard plan often is a toolbox, and being able to adapt that toolbox to the meta, to your learnings is just very important. It needs to be a dynamic part of your deck.
Yeah, I mean, you have the opportunity. So I guess adapting, right? You could take it 2 ways. I guess we're sort of more referring to adapting on the fly, right? Or are you talking about adapting as in like you play some matches and then you go back and you reevaluate your sideboard plan and adapt what that looks like?
Yeah, Hayden. So I am talking about the situation where you've had your sideboard plan, you played some games, and now you're coming back home and you're going to reevaluate, right? So you're going to ask yourself questions like, do I actually need 9/6 attacks into Prism, or maybe can I go down to 6 and have 3 spots that are going to be tools for other heroes, or maybe just added more power cards to accelerate the pressure I'm able to put out in that specific matchup.
Yeah, which makes sense, right? Like it's and it also, actually, if you were prepared with your plan to start with, that's just more sort of like mental capacity you can devote to those thinkings, right? Like you don't have to be trying to also think about actually what is your original sideboard plan.
Mm-hmm. And you figure out what cards work, what cards don't work, which ones are underperforming, which ones are overperforming. Like we talked about earlier. But the same thing of maybe you're using this card not enough in certain matchups. Maybe a card you've devoted multiple sideboard slots to a certain card. You end up playing it and it underperforms. It's actually not that good. Maybe it kind of derails you from your core game plan too much.
Yeah, and that's like the evaluation step when you come back to it. Which is, honestly, I actually think it's one of the most important things, because you could just like kind of rest in your laurels and be like, okay, this is the plan that I've got. This is what's happening. Like, I played it a bunch of times. It's like the plan that works. But if you don't sort of critically analyze it and come back and say like, well, actually, what's missing from the sideboard plan is that, or actually not even just missing, it could be actually active things that change, right? So we talked about earlier, you put in all these defense reactions and now my core game plan doesn't work. Like that's one of the things I think you can really be assessing during this time of reflection, as I would probably call it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you first build your sideboard plan, it is just based off pure theory. Mm-hmm. And if Flesh and Blood has told us anything, it's about, you got to get the testing in, you got to get the reps, you got to get the practice. And that's where theory meets reality. And then you come back, you kind of reevaluate and find some sweet spot in the middle where, where your deck is going to actually function at its highest potential, rather than, us cooking up all these crazy theories about sleep darting people and turning off hero abilities, right?
Yeah, well, I think theory is super important in Flesh and Blood, and especially in sideboarding and pre-boarding, because rather than just like trying to play every single hero play your deck into every single hero and then come up with a sideboard plan from there, I think you should always start with some theory behind what you're trying to do, right? You should always start grounded in, this is the idea that I have. I have this idea that I can move from this like aggressive deck and change 14 cards in my deck and become more of a mid-range build. And my theory is that won't hurt my ability to push damage and set up good hands. In practice, that could be very different, right? We're actually although your ratios still feel right, still feels like you haven't traded too many cards in and out that are too different. It might end up just being that your 4 and 5 card hands just don't play in the same way that they did previously, and that actually throttles the power of your deck massively. So theory was good, theory made sense, but in practice it just doesn't play out the way that you wanted it to. So go back to the drawing board. Maybe the plan changes completely. You scrap the transformational sort of sideboard of moving from aggressive deck to mid-range deck, or you just take a different approach. Maybe it just means that you need different cards, or some of these cards that you bring in need a bit more functionality to be both aggressive and defensive, for instance.
Now, Hayden, I want to do a little bit of back and forth with you to talk about some final tips or other tips for sideboarding. And I actually have some real world examples for this as well. So I think that talking to people who are enacting different plans than you and understand why they do it is really important, kind of cross-pollinating that knowledge and then using that to come back and improve your own board. This actually, when this happened to me, was at the calling, right? I was very, very happy with our chain deck. Even at the end, I still think that was the deck that I would have been on almost card for card for card after everything I had seen. But we did see that some chain players had actually opted for a card called Lunar Tide Plunderer, red, against Prism. And that was nothing special. It was a red that blocked 2. That's why we didn't ignore it. But you know what Lunar Tide Plunderer is really, really good against? A Bolton. So it was a double. It was a double whammy of being a phantasm breaker and a terrible card for Bolton to face against. So that's one I think we totally missed. Yep. If I was going to come back, you can bet that'd be in my sideboard.
Yep. Yeah. You take cues. Like, it could be talking, like you're saying, or it could be like spotting what people are doing. But I would say, like, if there's someone, even if it's to the point of down at local armory event, or your road to nationals, or your next skirmish this season, if you see someone with a different build than yours, why not just ask some questions about it? Maybe you guys play a mirror, you see a few different things be enacted, or you watch one of the games and you see something a little bit different to your plan that you hadn't really thought about. Just it doesn't mean that you need to go and change your deck to that, but it could be an idea. There could be a seed of something in there that you could take away from having a conversation with that player, I think.
For sure. I mean, even something as simple as why are you playing Shadow of Blasphemous? You can get a different take on it, and maybe they're right, maybe you're right, or maybe there's a middle ground where you guys are both kind of right, and we figure out a better way to play altogether. I mean, honestly, doing anything in a vacuum is going to lead to inefficiency, right? But I want to circle back here to talking about the core game plan is the most important. The biggest trap is over sideboarding, and sideboarding for the wrong reason. Just throwing in defensive cards into offensive plans could just totally ruin your game plan and actually make your deck worse. You're like, okay, if he crippling crushes me and I'm able to red unmovable that's amazing, right? But every situation where that doesn't happen and the card is terrible, maybe that's not what you want to do. And maybe even, let's say you do have those defense reactions, it might just be net better for you just to be on the aggressive the entire time and always have consistency to be able to do that.
Yeah. Do you know what? There's a good thing I think here with I think if you are naturally a bit more of someone who questions things, maybe a bit more of a pessimist, you have you like to say I want reasons to include this card, not reasons to not include the card. I think you're going to have a better approach, probably. Not saying you should be a pessimist and that's going to be great, but what I mean is that if you're questioning why these things come into the deck rather than just the reason they're in there, so why shouldn't they be in there, you're gonna find probably the weaknesses of these. So if I talk about a movable, well, the reason that this is great in my Katsu aggro deck against Dorinthia is that I can get it into Arsenal and I can blow out their Steelblade Supremacy turn, or I can find their biggest turn, I'm gonna pivot off of it, and that's a great point, that's great theory. But also, why shouldn't I include this in my deck? Well, it costs 3 and I only run 12 blues in my deck, or 15 blues. It's not a 0 cost, so I can't pitch it to my Katsu's ability. It doesn't pitch to let me have big turns. It's not an aggressive card. It's not an attack action, so it doesn't allow me to actually, play it out of my hand as an attack action. So there's all these reasons why you shouldn't include that card. So I think it's just as important for why you should include a card as why you shouldn't include cards. And then you just weigh it up at the end of the day. Maybe it's still the correct decision to have these unmovables in there because it's so good that even though it impacts your game plan negatively, it's only 3 cards and you can justify it or whatever. There's going to be reasons that you can or cannot justify it.
Yeah. And finally here, just kind of circling back on this one too, I think just don't be married to your sideboard, right? It is the toolbox of your deck often. So I think it needs to be a dynamic part as well. If it's not working, fix it. that is kind of the section that you can be the most creative with. That's where we see, I think, the biggest differentials around deck builds is what's in the sideboard and what tools are they bringing. Because a lot of it, most of the time, it's a meta call, right?
Mhm.
As Flesh and Blood continues to grow, more sets come into the game. Gone will be the days that you can just have a sideboard that can attack every single hero in the meta. So sometimes you got to just make concessions, right? You got to make a call in the meta and tune your sideboard to reflect that call. And maybe that means you don't have Null Rune 3. You've got the Null Rune 1, all those kind of things.
Yeah, the last thing I would say to round it out is I look at more and more as we move through this game, I'm looking at my sideboard options as like packages, I think, because they're things that I'm almost like plug and play into core game plans that I've got. So it could be like a Null Rune package like you're talking about that's 3 cards. It could be six card package of defense reactions. It could be a 12 card package of cards that change my game plan. Like I'm actively starting to look at this game more and more from a sideboarding stance of like packages and how those actually come into play. And that allows me to like sort of isolate them as well when things don't go right or the plan's not, what I feel like I should be on, or meta changes and I maybe move one of those packages out and another package comes in its place.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for listening. As we close out here, I do want to obviously shout out the YouTube channel that is Arsenal Pass on YouTube. We have tons of extra content there. We have our YouTube exclusive now moving towards
It is.
Streaming platforms near you, the Arsenal Pass Time of the Round. The format of that has also switched. We do have a guest coming on every single week. This week's guest is Carol from Flesh and Blood, the infamous developer and brute player. So really happy to be able to get him on. So check that out. There's also deck text, gameplay, everything you're looking for. And finally, the boomers of Welcome Wraith have figured out how to use Twitter. So Hayden is located at Fiendale, FYEN_Dale, and I am located at Brendan, BRENDAN, APG. I did switch away from the 50 Shades because it was just, there's just too much, 2 identities. I felt torn. And finally, a big thank you to all of our patrons. We're over 200 patrons already. It's incredible, how much we've grown and what it's allowed us to be able to do. Like I said, we do have exclusive content on there. If we host a deck tech on Arsenal Pass on Patreon, we're going to be posting, the actual, writing out all the sideboard guides for you, talking about deck theory, ratios, Excel sheets, everything you need to pick it up and start being competitive. We also have live sessions and extra pods and just, tons of content on there if you want to level up your game. Anyway, thank you all so much for listening, and we will see you in the next episode.
See you later.